The dust hadn't settled on Caldwell Ridge in 3 days. Not since the spring winds rolled down from the northern hills and stirred up the kind of restlessness that made grown men forget their chores and young women stare too long out of kitchen windows. Jacob Hale had ridden past the Miller place 4 times that week alone. Though anyone with eyes could see there was no reason for a rancher with 200 head of cattle and a fence line needing mending to be trotting his horse down a road that led nowhere near his property. He told himself it was about the well. The Miller well had been acting strange, the water running cloudy some mornings, and since old Thomas Miller had passed 2 winters back, leaving his daughter Eliza to run the small homestead alone with her young son, it seemed only neighborly for Jacob to check on it now and again. That was the excuse he gave himself, and it worked well enough until he caught sight of Eliza hanging laundry on the line. Her sleeves rolled to the elbow, sunlight catching the loose strands of brown hair that had escaped her braid, and his mind went as empty as a dry creek bed. He reined in his horse at the fence post, same as always, and called out a greeting that came out rougher than he intended. Eliza looked up from the basket of wet linens, and for a moment something soft crossed her face before she caught herself and straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. Hale," she said, the same careful formality she always used, though they had known each other since they were children racing barefoot along the creek behind the schoolhouse. "Come to check on the well again?" There was a teasing note buried under the politeness, and Jacob felt his ears warm despite the cool morning air. He climbed down from his horse anyway, looping the reins over the post, and made his way toward the pump at the side of the house, aware the whole while of her eyes following him, aware of the small boy, her son Tommy, peering around the corner of the porch with a frank curiosity only a 6-year-old could manage. The truth was, Jacob had loved Eliza Miller since he was 17 years old, back when her hair had still been worn in 2 braids and his voice hadn't yet dropped into the low register it held now. He had watched her marry Daniel Whitfield, a good man, a hard-working man, and he had stood at the back of the church with his hat in his hands and swallowed down every foolish hope he had ever carried. He had watched Daniel go off to help drive cattle north 2 years back and never come home, thrown from his horse in a storm somewhere past the Nebraska line, and Jacob had grieved for his friend honestly, without a shred of triumph in his heart, though he would be lying if he said some small, shameful part of him hadn't wondered, in the quiet hours after, whether there might someday be room for him in Eliza's life. He had never spoken a word of it. He simply kept finding reasons to ride by, to fix what needed fixing, to bring over a sack of flour or a jar of honey from his own hives, always careful to frame it as neighborly duty, always careful never to let his eyes linger too long or his voice grow too warm, because Eliza Whitfield, now Miller again, having taken back her father's name after Daniel's passing, was still grieving, and a woman deep in mourning did not need a rancher's clumsy affections pressed upon her. That morning, as he worked the pump handle and watched the water run clear after a few good pulls, he glanced over to find Tommy standing at his elbow, solemn as a preacher. "Ma says you come round too much for a man who don't need nothing from us," the boy said, with the blunt honesty children specialized in, and Jacob nearly dropped the wrench in his hand. Before he could stammer out a reply, Eliza's voice cut sharply across the yard, ordering Tommy to fetch more clothespins from the shed, and when the boy had scampered off, she stood there with pink creeping up her neck, refusing to meet Jacob's eyes. "He says things he oughtn't," she murmured. "Pay him no mind." But Jacob found he could not stop turning the boy's words over, wondering if they came from something Eliza herself had said in an unguarded moment, wondering if she had noticed what he thought he'd been hiding so carefully. He might have found the courage to speak that day, might have finally let some small truth slip past the wall he'd built around his heart, had the sound of an approaching carriage not interrupted them both. It was a fine rig, polished black with silver fittings, entirely out of place on the rutted road leading to the Miller homestead, and Jacob felt his stomach tighten before he even saw who sat inside it. The carriage rolled to a stop at the gate, and the driver hopped down to open the door, and out stepped a young woman in a traveling dress of deep rose silk, far too fine for the dust of Caldwell Ridge, her dark hair pinned beneath a small feathered hat. Jacob recognized her at once, though it had been years since he'd last seen her. Margaret Ashford, daughter of Wendell Ashford, the banker who held the note on half the ranches in the county, including, as it happened, Jacob's own. Margaret's arrival sent a ripple through the small gathering that would, within days, become the talk of the whole valley. She had come, she explained with a bright and practiced smile, to see about a parcel of land her father had recently acquired, land that bordered both the Miller homestead and Jacob's own ranch, and she had thought it only proper to introduce herself to the neighbors. There was something in the easy confidence of her manner, the way she surveyed the modest farmhouse and the laundry line and the barefoot boy peering out from behind the shed, that made Jacob's jaw tighten, though he could not have said exactly why. Eliza, for her part, greeted Margaret with the unfailing courtesy of a woman raised right, inviting her in for coffee despite the visible strain the unexpected guest had placed upon her morning, and Jacob found himself standing awkwardly at the edge of the yard, uncertain whether his presence was still wanted or whether he ought to take his leave. It was Margaret who settled the matter, turning to him with an appraising look that made him distinctly uncomfortable, and remarking that she had heard a great deal about the Hale Ranch and would very much like to see it, given that her father's bank held such an interest in its success. There was no polite way to refuse a request phrased so deliberately as a favor to her father, and so Jacob found himself, not an hour later, riding alongside Margaret's carriage back toward his own land, answering her questions about cattle prices and grazing acreage with the stiff politeness of a man who would rather have been anywhere else. He caught, just once, as he turned his horse toward the ridge, a glimpse of Eliza standing in her doorway, watching the carriage roll away, her expression unreadable at that distance, and something in his chest twisted uncomfortably at the sight. In the weeks that followed, Margaret Ashford made herself a fixture in Caldwell Ridge in a way that unsettled the whole community's rhythm. She called at the Hale Ranch with alarming regularity, always with some reasonable pretext, a question about the bank's ledgers, a concern about fence lines, an invitation to a supper her father was hosting for the town's more prominent families. Jacob, ever mindful that his ranch's future depended in no small part on remaining in Wendell Ashford's good graces, could not easily turn her away, and found himself drawn, almost against his will, into a courtship he had never sought and did not particularly want. Margaret was clever and well-spoken, and there was no denying she was beautiful, but there was a calculation beneath her charm that Jacob could not quite shake the sense of, a way she had of steering conversations toward his prospects, his land, his standing in the valley, as though she were assessing an investment rather than a man. Meanwhile, word of the banker's daughter's evident interest in Jacob Hale spread through Caldwell Ridge with the speed such things always traveled in small towns, and Eliza, though she said nothing of it directly, grew quieter whenever his name came up, and found more reasons of her own to keep busy elsewhere when Jacob rode past. He noticed the well no longer seemed to need his attention, that Tommy was often sent to a neighbor's when he called, that Eliza's replies to his greetings grew shorter and her eyes met his less often. It was as though a door that had been standing open, however cautiously, had begun slowly to close, and Jacob, wrapped up in his own confusion about how to extricate himself gracefully from Margaret's attentions without offending her father, did not understand until it was nearly too late just how much ground he had lost. The turning point came at the town's spring social, held in the Grange Hall with fiddle music and long tables of food brought by every family in the county. Margaret arrived on her father's arm, dressed in a gown far grander than the occasion called for, and made her way directly to Jacob's side with the easy assumption of a woman who believed the matter of their courtship was all but settled. Jacob, caught between courtesy and a growing desperation to make his true feelings known before the night ended, found himself scanning the crowded hall for a glimpse of brown hair and a familiar quiet smile, and his heart sank to find no sign of Eliza among the guests. It was Tommy who told him, tugging at his sleeve during a break in the dancing, that his mother had decided to stay home, that she'd said the hall would be too crowded and too warm, though the boy's troubled little face suggested he did not entirely believe his mother's excuse either. Jacob made his decision standing in the middle of that dance floor, with Margaret's hand still resting expectantly on his arm and half the county watching. He excused himself as gently as he knew how, aware of the murmurs that followed him, aware of Margaret's stunned expression and the flush of humiliation rising in her cheeks, and he walked straight out of that hall and saddled his horse in the cool dark of the evening without a single thought for what it might cost him with the bank. He rode hard for the Miller place, his heart hammering harder than the horse's hooves against the packed dirt road, rehearsing and abandoning a dozen different speeches along the way, until he arrived at last at Eliza's gate to find a single lamp burning in the front window. She answered his knock still in her work dress, hair loose around her shoulders, surprise and wariness both plain on her face at finding him there so late and so out of breath. Jacob did not give himself time to lose his nerve. He told her, standing there on her porch with his hat crushed in his hands, that he had been a coward for years, that he had hidden behind excuses about wells and fences and neighborly duty because he had been too afraid to tell her the plain truth, which was that he had loved her since they were children and had never once stopped, not through her marriage to Daniel, whom he had genuinely mourned as a friend, and not through these long months of watching her grieve from a careful distance. Terrified of overstepping, terrified of causing her more pain than she already carried. He told her that whatever Margaret Ashford believed about his intentions, whatever the whole town might be gossiping about after tonight, none of it mattered a lick compared to the truth of what he felt standing in front of her now. Eliza was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Jacob's stomach knotted with the fear he had ruined everything with his clumsy honesty. But when she finally spoke, her voice was thick with an emotion she no longer tried to hide. She told him she had noticed, of course she had noticed, every ride past her fence line, every excuse about the well, and that she had let herself hope, quietly and guiltily, that it meant something, until Margaret Ashford's carriage had rolled up her road and she had told herself firmly to stop being a fool, that a rancher with his eye on securing his land's future had no business courting a widow with a young son and no dowry to speak of. She said she had spent these past weeks trying to close her heart back up the way she'd closed it after Daniel died, and that it had been the hardest thing she'd done since his funeral, harder even than she wanted to admit. Jacob closed the distance between them then, and there, on the porch in the lamplight with the spring night settling soft and cool around them, he kissed her, gently and without a trace of the hesitation that had governed him for years, and felt her hands come up to rest against his chest, not pushing him away but holding on. When they finally parted, both of them a little breathless, a little disbelieving, Tommy's voice piped up from the doorway, where he had clearly been watching the whole exchange with undisguised delight, declaring that he'd known all along Jacob only came around because he liked his mother, and that he, personally, thought it was about time somebody said so out loud. The laughter that followed, shared between the three of them, felt like the first real lightness Jacob had known in longer than he cared to admit. The matter of Wendell Ashford's banknote did trouble Jacob in the days that followed, and he rode into town prepared for the worst, certain his humiliating exit from the social would cost him dearly. But Wendell, it turned out, was a more practical man than his daughter's wounded pride might have suggested, and after a stiff and uncomfortable conversation in his office, allowed that business was business and he saw no cause to punish a rancher's finances over a matter of the heart, though he did suggest, not unkindly, that Jacob might find it wise to keep some distance from Ashford family suppers for a while. Margaret herself left Caldwell Ridge not long after, her father's land dealings settled, and though Jacob always felt a twinge of guilt for the embarrassment he'd caused her, he heard within the year that she'd married well in the city, a match that suited her ambitions far better than a modest cattle ranch ever could have. Jacob married Eliza that autumn, in the same small church where he had once stood at the back with his hat in his hands and swallowed his hope whole, and this time he stood at the front, watching her walk toward him in a simple ivory dress, Tommy at her side proudly carrying the rings in his small careful hands. The whole valley turned out for the wedding, and old women who had watched Jacob ride past the Miller place for months with knowing smiles finally got to say aloud what they'd suspected all along, that the rancher had never once been checking on a well. He had been finding his way home the entire time, one small excuse at a time, until he'd finally found the courage to stop pretending and simply arrive. Eliza moved with Tommy to the Hale Ranch, and the well at the old Miller homestead was left for the tenant family Jacob hired to work the land, though he made certain, every spring after, to ride past it once himself, not out of any excuse this time, but simply because it had become, in his memory, the place where his whole life had quietly begun to change, one careful visit at a time, until love had worn a path too wide to ignore.